Hi, good morning, everyone. We're going to get started in just a second. We'll give people another few seconds to hop on, and then we'll start today's session. Thank you for joining us this morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this morning's session with ODE and the REL Midwest. We're really excited to have you on the line this morning, and we're happy to share some more information about ways that you can track learning changes after the disruptions and building closures and things that happened during COVID-19. So thank you so much for joining us this morning. I know that some people are still starting to hop on, but in the interest of time, we want to go ahead and get started. And just so everybody knows, we're recording this session for those who weren't able to join us live today. So we just ask, please, that you keep yourself muted if you're not speaking, but there will definitely be chances to interact through the chat box and through some breakout sessions during this meeting as well. So before we get started, we just wanted to do a quick introduction to the Zoom platform. Hopefully you're able to hear me right now. I should pause and say my name is Cora Goldston from REL Midwest, and we'll all kind of introduce ourselves in a moment as well. But hopefully you're able to hear me. But if not, or if your audio is a little choppy, you can go ahead and click that Join Audio button, and you should have the option to switch between listening through the phone or listening through your computer. There should also be an option in your Zoom toolbar for chat. So in just a second, we'll actually get into using that chat function. And then you can also turn on or off your webcam. We certainly invite you to join by webcam if you're able and would like to this morning, but you don't have to as well. It's perfectly fine to stay off of webcam. We will have some breakout sessions during the meeting where you'll be discussing things in a smaller group. And it would be great if you're able to join on webcam for those smaller breakout sessions as well. So we'll make good on our promise to use the chat box. So we would love to get to know all of you. Please, if you're able to, go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat box with your name, your title, and the region that you work in. And we will introduce ourselves as well. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues. Dom, would you like to introduce yourself first?
Sure. Thank you, Cora. Hi, everybody. I'm Dominique Bradley. I am a researcher at the American Institutes for Research, and I am also part of the Regional Education Laboratories Midwest. I'll turn it over to Susan.
Hi there, everyone. I'm Susan Berghauser. I'm also a researcher for the American Institutes for Research, and I'm a researcher with REL Midwest. I'll turn it to Cora.
Thanks, Dom and Susan. So my name is Cora Goldston. I'm a communication specialist with the Regional Educational Laboratory Midwest, and we'll tell you a little bit more about REL Midwest and what that is in a moment. So we just wanted to walk you through the plan for today's session. So of course, we're going through this agenda, and we'll tell you a little more about the goals for the session as well. We'll do a quick introduction to Regional Educational Laboratory, or REL Midwest, as well. And then we'll start diving into this toolkit to assess those learning changes. So we'll talk a little bit about the context for the toolkit, the components, and how you can use it. And we'll go in depth into each of those modules that's part of the toolkit as well. And the appendices that will help you kind of decide on supplemental analyses and things like that as well. Then we'll talk about the next steps and wrap up. And throughout this presentation, there will be plenty of time for questions as well. So we have a few goals today. So one is developing an understanding of these toolkit modules and appendices and how these might be helpful as you're supporting districts as they're kind of trying to assess how things have changed or kind of what the effects were from those COVID closures or other disruptions that may have happened. We'll also have some more interactive pieces of this session where you can practice using the toolkit components, and then identify places where you may have questions or clarifications about the toolkit before you're starting to use this with districts. So during the presentation, we're going to be talking through several files. So I think some of these were shared out before the session. But also my colleague Dom is putting the toolkit in the chat box now. And there's the toolkit workbooks. There's also 2 decision trees that we'll walk through more in depth. One is for you as the regional data leads, and then one is for the district that mirrors that regional data lead tree closely as well. So as I mentioned, we just wanted to do a quick introduction of REL Midwest. So REL Midwest is one of 10 regional educational laboratories across the country that's funded by the U.S. Department of Education, and more specifically, the Department of Education's Institute of Education Sciences. And the REL provides research and technical support, training and coaching to states, districts, regional stakeholders, and other education stakeholders. And you can see our region is the stark blue region here at the top, which of course includes Ohio. So REL Midwest offers a wide variety of supports. We do applied research to directly answer questions from the stakeholders in the region. We also do more technical assistance, technical training, support, workshops, events, and things to help people understand and use the research and to use research-based practices. We also provide an Ask a REL service in case you have any questions about a particular education topic. We're happy to round up the research on that. But this is just to kind of give you a quick idea of the types of work that we do. So as I mentioned, REL Midwest is that kind of region at the top that includes 7 states, which includes Ohio. And so we've been working closely with the Ohio Department of Education to develop this toolkit and provide supports to regional data leads and districts as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Dom to introduce this toolkit.
Hi, thanks so much, Cora. I appreciate it. I just want to start out by saying thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We're very excited to present this toolkit to you. And just a quick reminder, if you have questions along the way, please go ahead and drop them in the chat box. We will be monitoring it. All right, so today we're going to spend our time talking about the toolkit and how this can be used in supporting you and your roles with districts. We've designed the toolkit as a resource, not only for districts themselves, but for the regional data leads and those who support districts. With this toolkit, you will have the recorded webinar that will be uploaded on the REL Midwest website. I've dropped the link in the chat box. You have the RDL decision tree, which is unique to Ohio. So again, this whole toolkit will actually be publicly available for anybody to access, but this particular training and the decision tree was designed particularly for Ohio's regional data leads. And we have some additional resources provided by the Ohio Department of Education. So you'll find that in Appendix D. Okay, next slide, please. So we designed the toolkit for use by districts themselves, but the webinar and the RDL decision tree, again, is designed to help support you in supporting those districts and help structure some of those conversations and activities. We're going to reference the toolkit as well as the RDL decision tree throughout. We'll show you kind of the differences between the RDL decision tree and the district decision tree. So who should use this toolkit? Districts that should be using this toolkit, that you should support them in using this toolkit, are interested in learning about changes due to COVID-19 school closures. So that's sort of the first requirement, having an interest in the content. And the second qualification is they need to have some ideas coming to the table before you actually start to step through this toolkit of what they're interested in learning about. The decision trees will actually help you figure out which module based on those questions that you should be going to. So I just want to note, we'll talk about this a little bit later too, these sort of guiding questions, we'll refer to them as research questions throughout. So that's just sort of a flag. We understand that districts don't often use that language, but that is what we use in the toolkit. It's important to note too that this toolkit was designed so that districts that have limited capacity either to conduct a quantitative analysis or don't have the appropriate data, it's designed so that these districts can continue to use the toolkit to collect additional data or qualitative methods. Okay, next slide, please. So if the two conditions are met, this is where the toolkit is meant to start off. So your district is interested in learning about learning changes, and they have some formulation of research questions or guiding questions that they want to answer. So once these two conditions are met, this is where the regional district or the regional data lead decision tree starts. So this is sort of a close-up of that data lead RDL tree. So you should have that in that separate PDF. So this is the only thing that's separate from the toolkit because it's specific to Ohio. So beyond this, the decision trees actually mirror each other between the RDL tree and the district tree. The language throughout the toolkit is designed for districts to engage with, but the webinar is really targeted at helping you all sort of understand how this is meant to support districts and start to think about sort of what districts this would be appropriate for use in and how you would use the toolkit to help districts in answering these questions. So we start with, does the districts have standardized assessment data? So that's sort of the first next question. So they're interested in learning about learning changes. They've got some sort of questions around it. Do they have assessment data? You go to number 2. So do they have the capacity? And we'll walk you through this in mod 1. So if those questions are, you answer yes. The third question is if the district's collecting standardized assessment data. So you see how the decision tree is working. If it's no, well, the decision tree will lead you to a different module. Okay, next slide. So I'm actually going to turn it over to Heather Boughton to provide some context as to why we designed this toolkit. Okay, Heather, I'd like you to come on screen. Thank you.
Hi, good morning, everyone. First, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us this morning and taking the time to sort of engage in this discussion with REL Midwest and with your peers and colleagues around the state. And also, I want to make sure I take the time to say thank you to the REL Midwest team for putting all of this together. As Dom said, you know, this is something that we've been working on with them on over the summer. Our initial conversation actually we started having some conversations this past spring because, like many of you, I'm sure, during the school building closure period, it became quickly apparent that our students were really engaged in a wide range of educational experiences. And that's true across when we look across the state. It's also true when we look within districts and even within schools. Our students, because they were learning from home, were really having just a variety of experiences in terms of their continued learning. And so we kind of knew that when they returned to the classroom, they'd be coming from different places and having had different experiences. And so started to think through with REL Midwest, how do we start to capture that in the data and in a way that will be useful for educators to help educators understand where students are when they return to the classroom so that they can meet them where they are, meet their needs. And so out of those initial discussions, this set of resources was born, and one second. My own child is also learning from home right now. So excuse me. So we started to sit down and think through what can be the most useful set of tools for districts, and how can the Regional Data Lead Network help support them in carrying out this important work of understanding where students are. And so I want to note a couple of my favorite things about this is that, one, it was informed by several regional data leads. Their input was part of this, and we very much appreciate that because it was very valuable input. And two, this toolkit is sort of agnostic in some ways to the kinds of data a district might have, or the level of sophistication that their data teams may have. We know that varies. And so what I hope to convey, and what I hope that you all feel and convey to your districts, is that everyone can do something with data. We may not all have very sophisticated data and research analysis teams available to us, but everyone can do something to learn a little bit more about where their students are. And one of my second favorite things about this is that it's really relevant right now, but it will continue to be relevant into the future, and really is a kind of exercise that we could engage in every year, at the beginning of the year and throughout the year. And so I just really appreciate those aspects of this resource. I hope that you all find this to be useful. I want to say that we're very open to feedback on it, on the webinar itself, and also on the resources. If there are other things that you need that we can help support you in, we are here and happy to do that. So thank you very much again to everyone. I'm going to kick it back over to Dom to carry on.
Thanks so much, Heather, for providing that context. And it was fantastic working with your team. And yes, the regional data leads that participated in our first brainstorming sessions and helped us build out the toolkit, their input was absolutely invaluable in understanding how this work actually takes place with districts. So we very much appreciate that. And we're excited to do this in partnership with Ohio Department of Ed. So just to reiterate what Heather had said about the toolkit, it really is meant for any district to be able to use. You'll see throughout the toolkit that we have sort of pause points and guided conversations to help districts sort of figure out and orient themselves to what they actually can accomplish. And the toolkit itself is really meant for looking at learning changes and experiences at the school and district level. So this isn't really a classroom level oriented kind of analysis. So just put that out there at the very beginning. All right, next step, please. So we wanted to orient you towards some key terms that we use throughout the toolkit. This is in part just to make it a little more readable as well. So when we say pre-COVID-19, that refers to the period before school buildings closed. We do recognize that learning continued remotely in different fashions. We say post-COVID-19, that's after those school building closures. We completely recognize that we are still not post-COVID-19, but as a time point, we're going to refer to that as post-COVID-19. And then learning changes refer to the difference between expected and actual scores on standardized assessments, where the actual scores are meaningfully different from the expected scores. And then remote learning, we understand there's a wide variety of what encapsulates remote learning. So throughout the toolkit, we've actually used the ODE definition of remote learning. So instruction taking place outside of the traditional school setting when the learner and educator are separated by time and or distance. So that includes digital and analog approaches. So throughout the toolkit, we'll use these common references. Right. Next slide, please. So who should use the toolkit? Again, the toolkit is really designed itself for use by district level research staff or district staff that deal with data and assessment on a regular basis. So the webinar, like I said, is designed for Ohio in particular because you guys have this excellent capacity by having regional data leads to actually support districts. Because the toolkit is will be widely available on the IAS website, we did design the toolkit itself in mind for districts that might be trying to do this themselves as well. The toolkit is designed for districts regardless of their capacity, so limited capacity or knowledge to conduct these analysis. It is not meant for teachers or instructional staff. It's not really meant to be interpreted at that level. What Heather mentioned earlier too is that it's also meant to serve as a support at different time points. So it's not really meant to be a one and done kind of use. It's meant to be used over and over again so that you can continue to understand the impacts. It's meant for use to analyze data at the district or school level also. And it's meant to be used across districts. Again, it is agnostic. The modular design of the toolkit is meant to allow districts choice in how they're approaching analysis of learning loss. All right, next slide. So we just want to step you very quickly through the organization of the toolkit itself. We do recognize that there is a lot of content in this webinar. We will have a little break later on. We're hoping to break up the content some by having breakout sessions, but I do encourage you at any point in time, throw a question in the chat box, and we are moderating it. So one of us will stop whoever is speaking. So this toolkit is designed in modules. The first 3 modules are oriented towards a quantitative analysis. So stepping districts through going from those initial guiding questions, refining them, coming up with some solid research questions in which they have targeted analysis. And then modules 2 and 3 step the districts through if they're assessing the data quality and then actually conducting the analysis and interpreting findings. For districts that either don't have that capacity or their data is not key, or if their data is not quality, or they have different kinds of questions, so need sensing questions, experiential questions, they'll skip straight to module 4. So those are new and complementary data collection activities. And then module 5 is sort of where we expect all districts to end up, which is figuring out sort of the next steps and what kind of resources and research they need to do to continue. Next slide. And with these modules, they're meant to be used in tandem with the appendices. So Appendix A is the district decision tree. The RDL decision tree is unique and special for Ohio, so that's why you don't see it here in the appendix. Appendix B is, and we'll refer to these throughout, and I will say in your toolkit, each of these areas are hyperlinked in your toolkit, so you should be able to easily jump back and forth. So all of the workbooks that you'll need to conduct the conversation activities that we have throughout the toolkit are in Appendix B and Appendix C. So in modules 1 through 3, we use Appendix B, and modules 4 and 5 rely on Appendix C. And then special for Ohio, we have the additional ODE resources that they've provided. All right, next slide. So like I said, there's 5 different modules. We expect districts and you as RDL supporting districts to rely on the decision trees throughout to navigate your way through those modules. We do have pause points throughout the toolkit that asks you to go back and refer to your decision tree to see if you should be in a different module or if you need to move forward or go backward a step and reassess. Like I said, modules 1 through 3 are really designed for those districts with that kind of data capacity. Okay, next slide. Module 4 is these new data collection activities. So in this module, we really just provided some high-level guidance on surveys, interviews, and focus groups, the kind of considerations that districts might have by employing this kind of method of data collection, and also sort of what the pluses and minuses are that they should be considering in terms of their capacity to do this sort of data collection. And then module 5, as I said before, is sort of that last step of action planning. Who do you share findings with? How is this going to be useful? So making sure that whatever research that districts are doing is going to be useful and impactful for their students in the end. Okay. Next slide. So we have this lovely little hyperlinked slide in the toolkit. So each of these bubbles are hyperlinked to the section in the toolkit, so you can use this to easily bounce back and forth. And you can kind of see that the district decision tree is meant to be used throughout. Modules 1 through 3 are connected to that Appendix B, and then modules 4 and 5 are connected to Appendix C, and then we have those additional resources in Appendix D. When this goes into the IES website, we'll actually change out the Ohio Department of Ed resources, and those will be references to IES's website. So make sure you hold on to this version of the toolkit. Next slide. I just want to pause very quickly to see if there's any questions about the organization of the toolkit or the level of use. So I'm not seeing anything pop up, but go ahead and pop those in at any point in time, and we will be monitoring the chat box. All right. And so with that, I'm going to turn this back over to Cora.
Great, thank you so much, Dom, for the introduction to the toolkit. So as we mentioned earlier, we're going to walk through each of these modules in the toolkit. And module 1 is about refining your research questions, assessing capacity or the district's capacity, and planning for analysis. So just as a quick reminder, the expectation is at this point the district would have research questions or be starting to form research questions related to learning changes from COVID-19. And you'll use those research questions, as you'll see in a second, as a jumping off point. Also, there's an expectation at this point that all districts have some sort of learning assessment data available as you're jumping into this module. And just as a quick note, there's a link to the file for the toolkit here in the chat box. So if you need a copy of the toolkit, it should be here in the chat box, but also let us know and we're happy to repost it as well. So before beginning module 1, you'll want to be looking at that decision tree. And here on the screen, you'll see the district decision tree, and you'll see this throughout the modules as well. But we also have in this red box here a note about where the same point is on the RDL tree. So here we're just showing you on the district tree so that you can see what this will look like as you're actually working with your districts. So if you're working with a district, before you dive into module 1, the district will have wanted to draft those kind of initial research questions and then land at point 6. So this is kind of making sure that they've decided they want to assess learning changes and that they are collecting standard assessment data. And from there, we'll start to use this module to refine their research questions. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Susan to talk a little bit more about this module.
All right, thank you so much, Cora. Yes, and I just wanted to note as well, as we're walking through these slides, these mirror what are in the toolkit. So this is what a district would see as they were working through the toolkit and as you were helping them move through the toolkit. Okay, so the purpose of module 1 is to help the user lay the groundwork for conducting the analysis. And it guides the user in refining research questions, assessing whether they have the capacity to answer those questions, and then creating an action plan for data analysis. And as Dom mentioned, you'll be using those appendices in the toolkit as you work through all the modules. And for this module in particular, the district decision tree, and then the planning for analysis workbook, and specifically worksheet 1A, which you'll start filling out in this module. And that one kind of carries with you as you go, and also worksheet 1B. All right, next slide, Cora. Okay, so the first step in module 1 is to refine research questions. Okay, next slide. Okay, and so the toolkit actually helps define what a research question is in this context, acknowledging that some district staff might be familiar with the term research question, but as you support these staff, you may want to frame that term using the definition and examples provided in the toolkit. And you can assist districts to take a question that's not specific or measurable and narrow it down into a series of questions that are refined and answerable. So here it provides the definition of a research question, questions of interest that are specific, definable, and measurable through extant data analysis or new data collection. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the toolkit also provides some examples to show how a general question on the part of district staff could be turned into a more useful and addressable research question for use in the toolkit. So, for example, a district might start with a very general question: how are my students doing since COVID-19 began? And then you could kind of help them target a population that they're particularly interested. Do my district's English learner students need extra support post-COVID-19? So that's getting closer to the type of research question that you want to get to. And then another iteration, are post-COVID-19 learning changes in reading proficiency different for English learner students compared with other students in my district? So again, here you've got something down that's useful and actionable and narrowed that could be answered. Okay, next slide. So the toolkit next describes what the analyses outlined in modules 1, 2, and 3 can do, and these are those quantitative analyses. So they can help determine where to target extra resources or funding for specific student groups that appear to have greater learning changes post-COVID-19, and also to conduct estimates during the year or across several years, as Heather alluded to continue to monitor the trajectory of learning changes post-COVID-19. Next slide. And then the toolkit next describes the type of research questions that the analyses can address. So have students' learning changed post-COVID-19? Do student learning changes vary by student, school, or classroom characteristics? Next slide. So importantly, the toolkit also describes the kinds of research questions that the analysis cannot address. So it cannot address the question, what is the isolated impact of COVID-19 related school closures on student achievement? So these analyses don't allow us to contribute changes in student learning to a single specific isolated cause. As you know, many things occur during this time period, so we can't isolate it to any one thing. Also, another thing that they cannot address, why might a given intervention or program appear to have effectively buffered students from learning changes? So you could do an analysis where you included an indicator of whether a student participated in a certain aspect or program during the time post-COVID-19. However, these analyses are not intervention or program evaluations, so it couldn't really speak to why that program might have had a buffering effect. You could, see something there. Okay, next slide. And the toolkit also provides several cautions for districts as they conduct these analyses. So one major caution is there are no comparison groups, right? All students experience the COVID-19 pandemic. They also cannot measure or control for variation in the quality of instruction or specific student experience during these closures. That might be something you could get more to with some qualitative data or something like that, but these specific analyses won't be able to speak to that. And these analyses cannot quantify the magnitude or impact of corresponding events or other potentially related factors. So family illness, job loss, other trauma that the students might have experienced. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the toolkit is also designed to encourage discussion and teamwork among districts and the regional data leads, you all. So the workbook pages are intended to help districts keep track of their planning. And so here in the toolkit, it instructs users to use the guidance provided in the previous slides to discuss research questions with their team and refine them to adhere to the guidance that was given in this module. It also instructs them to use the Planning for Analysis workbook, worksheet 1A, to list refined research questions. And if you can go to the next slide, Cora, this is in the toolkit here like this, but also in worksheet 1A. This is the analytical framework worksheet. And so the district would be filling this out throughout modules 1 through 3, and we start here with listing research questions that the district wants to undertake. And so we just have the two general types of research questions filled in here, and of course the district's research questions would be more specific. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we're now going to have an activity. So if you could all please go to the chat box and share out answers to one or both of the following questions. So what types of research questions have you heard from the districts you support? Or what types of research questions do you think the districts you support might have? And Cora will go ahead and read out some of your answers.
Don't be shy. Feel free to share your thoughts in the chat box.
And it may be that you don't really know at this point what your districts might be thinking about, but maybe you have some ideas that you'd want to share.
Great. So I see Christine shared a thought that equity concerns might be something districts want to start looking at. Kathleen had a question or a thought about whether students in virtual learning environments were doing better or worse than students in face-to-face environments. And Lani shared a question about how far are students behind this year as compared to past years. If anyone has other thoughts about the types of research questions you might want to look at, feel free to share those as well.
Okay. Well, if we see any more, we can share them out later. Okay, so we can go on to the next slide. Okay, so the next part of Module 1 prompts users of the toolkit to assess their capacity to conduct an analysis and to define their plan for the analysis. Next slide. So now the toolkit points users to the Planning for Analysis workbook and specifically worksheet 1B. And this worksheet has the user and their team answer the following questions. Who could be able to clean and assess data quality? Who can run analyses? What kinds of technical assistance do you need to prepare and perform analyses? What is the timeline to complete your analysis? Is it reasonable? Does the timeline allow you to share results with the appropriate audiences in time to assist with this decision making? So really getting them to think through this capacity and also whether they're going to have results in time to assist with decision making. And with these worksheets, I want to encourage you as regional data leads to think through how you might help facilitate these discussions with your districts, and also to re-emphasize the use of these the worksheets and the workbooks in shaping the planning process. They're an important part of the toolkit, and as Dom mentioned, they're all hyperlinked within the toolkit itself, but they're also all the way down the bottom in the appendices if you're looking for them. Okay. Next slide, please. So we're now going to have an activity where you're going to be sent out into breakout rooms to have small group discussions. But before we do send you out into those breakout rooms, we're going to have you take 1 minute to think of some initial thoughts to the following questions. And as you're doing so, picture one of the districts that you work with and think about what research questions you think this district will want to address. And then using that Planning for Analysis workbook, worksheet 1B, what issues do you think might arise when estimating their capacity to conduct a study? What supports might be available? And then what cautions you would give the district in developing a research agenda to estimate learning loss, data quality, human capital concerns, those types of things. So go ahead and take a minute to jot down some initial responses. So I want to note that the questions are going to be in the chat, which will follow you into your breakout session. But also there is a Google document that has the questions listed, and the link is also in the chat to get to that document. And so Cora is going to send you all into those breakout sessions now, and we will pop in as you discussed to check in, but we'll see you back in a few minutes.
Great, so I'm going to send everyone to the breakout rooms and just send me a chat message if something's not working or if you get kicked out of your room.
I'm sorry, I was driving and I'm trying to switch off my phone and into the computer now because I just got home.
Oh, no problem at all.
But I'm still in on my phone. I just was trying to switch over.
No problem. I'm just trying to see if I can rejoin you to the breakout room. So hopefully I can get you to the right spot.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. Heather, I'm so sorry. I'm having trouble adding you back to the breakout. But I'm going to keep trying, and the group will come back together in a minute, so we'll be able to hear everyone's reflections as well.
Okay, I'm sorry I'm being difficult. I was just trying to switch back off my phone. That was it. Sorry.
No problem at all. Hi.
Okay. Yeah, welcome back.
Great. Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for having those great discussions and starting to think about research questions and cautions as well. We just wanted to take a minute to have everybody share out and kind of share what you've discussed and hear from the other groups as well. So we'll just do a quick kind of round robin through the breakout groups and invite everyone to chime in. So I'm going to start with the first breakout group, which had Janice, Lisa, Matthew, and Tom. Would anyone just like to share a quick tidbit of what you discussed in your session?
Sure, I will. We were just
going to
talking.
nominate you anyways.
Oh, thanks, Tom. You're so kind. We had just discussed at the end there, just talking about trying to administer benchmark assessments, whether it's in person or remote, and how districts are struggling with how to really consider that data when a kiddo is taking a remote benchmark, and it's hard to monitor that. So when we're looking at validity, that is definitely a concern. And again, we talked about how some districts are using a third party to provide instruction for the VLA. So again, alignment of standards, just in general, some of those concerns.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing, Janice. Would anyone from the second breakout group, it looks like this is Brittany, Kathleen, Kathy, Mark, and Mike. Would anyone like to share a little bit about what you discussed?
So I guess I could, this is Kathy or Kathleen. We talked about, similar to what was just shared, the issue of having valid and reliable assessment data if students are taking assessments at home, and how we assure that there's integrity to that data. We talked about the possibility of a lack of state testing data for another year, which is we thought a valuable source of information that may not be available to us again. And it's a way to hold ourselves accountable and a way to gather data that we could use to compare previous experiences with current experiences in terms of learning environment. We also talked about how the districts are still struggling with the most basic concepts or the most basic issues of assuring every student has access to the instruction with appropriate technology and appropriate supports, while parents and students are still working and going to school at home, and maybe multiple people in the same household going to school at home with parents who aren't able to supervise. So we talked about how districts are still just struggling with some of those basic restart issues, and maybe aren't even ready to look at data even though they'd like to.
That's very true, Kathleen. Yeah, there's questions about the data itself and the issues to kind of consider there, but also, like you said, the capacity of just being able to support students at that at-home learning overall as well. And that's, I'm sure, top priority for districts. Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing. How about breakout room 3? It looks like this was April, Coy, Gary, and Scott.
So I will talk for our group here. April and I shared with Dom the kind of concerns we have are that we're concerned there's no buy-in from our districts because they're just so worried about other things going on, and because April and I both work with very rural, small districts who don't have capacity. I mean, I service 9 districts, April has 8 districts, and we are the person for them. So if we're talking about the research specialist, it's us working with all these districts, and they just, unfortunately right now, in my perspective, a lot of our districts just kind of buried their head in the sand and want to get back to normal and don't want anything else to deal with anything, and if they ignore it, it's not there. So part of the discussion we had at the end was, in this training, it would be nice to, or through the trainings or resources or whatever, to talk about how do you make those inroads, how do you break this down into some manageable pieces to get a foot in the door in those districts that don't see this as a priority.
Yeah, that is a great point, and I think that's definitely something we can speak to a little bit, whether, partly in this training, but also we can keep connecting about that afterwards and how to kind of get that buy-in, and hopefully help districts understand that this is a resource to help them plan instruction and support their students as well. Thank you, Gary. Great, so would someone from Breakout Room 4 like to chime in? We had Dan, Liesel, and Ray in that room.
I'll go ahead and talk for our group. I can just say ditto to a lot of the things that the first three groups have brought up. The questions about remote testing, that's the only research-oriented question I've gotten from any of my districts in Warren County is, how do we do remote map testings? What are the pitfalls there? There's just no real good way to ensure there's going to be good data collection for these remote versus in-classroom scenarios. We're also quite concerned that the state testing might lose another year, and that's really the best data we ever get. And the districts are just trying to make things happen and make remote learning as good as possible.
Great. Thank you, Dan. Yeah, there's definitely trends here, and districts are trying to do the best that they can with remote learning, and also thinking about, when you think about the learning assessment data itself, what that means and what can kind of be inferred from doing that at home. Great. How about breakout room 5? So this group had Cheryl, Lynn, Mindy, Summer, and Susan.
This is Lynn. I can talk for our group, and please add in if you wish. We went through many of the same questions and concerns that the other groups had. It really is difficult to try and help them look at this kind of data when they're still in survival mode.
Definitely. And I would say too, definitely, as we kind of go through these modules in the toolkit, if there are places of particular concern where something just seems like it may not be feasible for a district, or you have questions about how to broach that, especially since districts are kind of in that reactive mode, definitely chime in and let us know. As Heather mentioned earlier, we are very open to feedback on the webinar, the toolkit, and any thoughts that you have since you work directly with the districts and kind of know what they're facing as well. Great. So how about breakout room 6? So this had Christine, Christy, Lonnie, and Peggy. Would someone like to share a little bit about what you discussed?
I don't mind sharing for our group, and everybody else chime in. We did talk about learning loss, online versus in person, those types of questions. We did agree with the other groups, a lot of our districts, not a lot of our districts, all of our districts right now are in some sort of survival mode. Just restart issues, graduation plans at risk, and SEL and how we're going to follow up with those students, and OTES and how that might look online, and absenteeism and OIP. And they have a lot going on right now. We did talk about, we do feel like some of our districts may have assumptions of, that maybe there is a gap with a certain group, or that, without even looking at the data, and they just go with it instead of going back to the data and what does it really say, or how can we really research that, figure out what's happening. And is that assumption really true? And is it evidenced in the data? So we did talk about that, but yeah, some concerns with people being in survival mode. And one more thing we're sharing with them or prompting them to do.
Absolutely, Christine, especially if the district does feel like they have kind of assumptions or thoughts about what might be going on. There might be some additional reluctance there to dive into it when there's already so much that's also going on with the district. So thank you for sharing that. And last but not least, we'll go to breakout room 7. So this was Kathy, Charles, Jackie, and Jill. Would anyone like to share a little bit about what you talked about?
Okay, I can share a couple of items. Being last, we had similar conversations as the other groups. I think one of the big things that we talked about was asking that questions: do our districts have the structures in place or the capacity to be able to do the research and to spend the time with this. And we talked about some of our districts having data coaches. Those that have data coaches, yes, things can move forward, and BLTs in place. And in some of our school districts, they've had data coaches, or they've worked through some processes that hopefully, some of those are still in place for them to move forward. We also talked about concerns about assessments and data collected also. Anybody else want to chime in? Okay.
That's great. Thank you so much, Kathy. It's been really helpful to hear across the groups these common kind of threads, thinking about everything that districts already have on their plates, and just kind of being able to work with districts so that this isn't something that's just an additional ask, but kind of finding a way to work this in where it may be helpful, as districts are really are kind of being responsive and trying to support their students. And also just thinking about the data itself that you're receiving, and trying to figure out, what can you take away from learning assessment data that happened remotely, and thinking about, maybe even thinking ahead to collecting data this year as well. So it's been really valuable hearing about your insights. Thank you so much for taking the time to reflect on these questions and issues and challenges as well. So now we're going to just talk a little bit about what happens next. So as you're working with the districts, you'll want to revisit your decision tree. And so again, on the screen, we're showing the district tree. So at a certain point, it will mirror the RDL tree in terms of the points and the questions that are being asked, but the numbers are slightly different. So on the district tree, you would want to follow the tree from points 1 through 11 to decide which module should come next. And on the RDL tree, these are the decisions from points 3 to 9. So before leaving module 1, you'll want to make sure you know kind of where you are on that district decision tree and then move to that appropriate module. So each module will refer the user back to the decision tree, and you'll see this theme as we're kind of going through today's presentation. You'll see it in the toolkit as well. And so at this point, the districts will have, they'll have assessed their capability to conduct a quantitative analysis, and then if they have the capacity to do so, then you'll move on to module 2 and start laying out kind of that plan and starting to do analysis. Or you can move to module 4 if quantitative analysis may not be the most feasible for that district, and explore other options to collect data and gather information as well. So we just wanted to pause here and see if anyone has questions about module 1 and kind of the steps that are involved, or what you may do to work with districts through this module. And feel free to put questions in the chat box, or you can also unmute and ask questions as well. Okay, so I'm not seeing any questions at the moment, but definitely please feel free to put questions in the chat box, and we'll also have some Q&A time after the next module session as well. So with that, we're going to move on to module 2, so cataloging and assessing your data. And as I mentioned just a second ago, not all districts will move on to module 2. If districts are not planning to do a quantitative analysis, then they might move to module 4 instead and look at those other kind of qualitative opportunities. So before beginning module 2, you'll want to make sure that you've worked with the district through module 1 and that you've landed at point 12. So this is ensuring that the district has both the staff expertise and the capacity or the time to analyze quantitative data. And then from here, we'll move through module 2. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Susan to talk more through this module.
Thanks so much, Cora. And something, I was hearing and I just wanted to emphasize is that, there's this idea of when and when can we prioritize this and not wanting to overwhelm your districts. And so maybe that you get through module 1 and you say, well, we do have the capacity, we just don't have it now. And that doesn't mean you can never do this type of analysis, but it might just not be the right time. And so kind of thinking through maybe broaching it that way with districts so as not to overwhelm them, but so that they know this tool is out there. So kind of having a sense of like how you're going to roll this out to districts and get that buy-in, but also considering that everybody is maybe too overwhelmed at this point to actually act on it. So being thoughtful about that as well. Okay, so next slide. All right, so module 2 of the toolkit can be used by a district once they determine that they have standardized assessment data and they've completed their analytical work plan, which is worksheet 1B. Module 2 helps the user prepare their data and set the groundwork for their analysis. Specifically, it guides the user in the following steps: assessing data quality and capacity and preparing for analysis. And the resources used in this module are, again, the district decision tree, which we use all the way throughout the module or throughout the toolkit, and the planning for analysis workbook. Here, you're going to continue using worksheet 1A, which is the analytic framework, and then also use worksheets 1C and 1D, which help do an inventory of the available data. Okay, next slide, Cora. Okay, so first, the module aids users in taking a close look at their data. Next slide. So importantly, a district must have standardized assessment data to perform the analyses. So these analyses use standardized assessment data pre and post COVID-19 to determine learning changes. And these analyses are intended to be carried out with standardized assessments that are administered to students district-wide, so not within an individual classroom. And this part of the toolkit has users complete worksheet 1C in the Planning for Assessment workbook, and that's an inventory of standardized assessment data. Next slide, please. So the toolkit lays out a few conditions that must be met for the standardized assessment data, and the toolkit explains what those are. So first is that data are available for multiple pre-COVID-19 time points and at least one post-COVID-19 time point. So this allows for the establishment of a pre-existing trend in standardized assessments that you can then compare with post-COVID-19 assessments. And I just want to pause here and re-emphasize, this doesn't mean that you had to have conducted that test in the fall. So we'll get to that a little bit later. But again, the timing, it might be that districts are not doing standardized assessments in the first term students are back this academic year. That does not preclude you from doing this analysis. But you do have to actually do a standardized assessment post-COVID-19. Okay, and then data must also be from standardized tests in core subjects that are administered regularly. So standardized tests are not perfect, but they are more reliable at estimating change because they are consistently administered each year. Okay, next slide. And then the toolkit also lays out a few conditions that would be ideal for the standardized assessment data. And the toolkit, again, explains what those are. So the tests are administered at the same time each year. So for example, fall, but also winter, spring. And the reason is that student performance can change based on the time of the year of the test. So if you're comparing tests pre-COVID-19 that were administered in fall with a test that you administered in spring post-COVID-19, just keeping in mind that the seasonality could have an effect there and the impact that might have on your results, just keeping that in mind throughout your analyses. And that the test is administered within the first month of the school year. Again, this isn't ideal. It's not a necessary thing. So this would allow you to conduct your analysis early on and use those results to inform decision-making earlier. But again, this is only an ideal condition, not a necessary condition. Okay, next slide, Cora. Okay, so the toolkit also emphasizes the importance of assessing missingness of standardized assessment data pre and post COVID-19. So I think a lot of you had this conversation when you were in your small groups, but missingness is most likely not random for post COVID-19 assessment data. It's likely that certain populations of students are not represented in that post COVID-19 standardized assessment group, and in particular, potentially now, so maybe not having the same kind of testing options for remote learners. So something to keep in mind and to consider when interpreting results of your analyses or determining whether or not you can use this season of testing data. Non-random missingness could have important implications for your findings. So understanding where those data are missing and factoring that into your considerations is important. Okay, next slide. And then the toolkit also provides considerations for assessing learning assessment data. So it's best practice to conduct validation checks when assessing the quality of your data. And the toolkit does provide some examples of what a district might look at when they're doing these types of checks. This is not an exhaustive list, but doing this missing data audit, looking at potentially implausible values, does the data fall within the expected ranges, those types of things, and then the distribution of the data. Does the distribution seem reasonable? Is there an unexpected skew? Those types of questions. And users can log all of these issues using that worksheet 1C in the Planning for Analysis workbook, and that specifically looks at the inventory for standardized assessment data when thinking about what standardized assessment data they have and where these issues might come from. Okay, so next slide. And I just, again, want to emphasize that the worksheets that are provided in the toolkit are meant to provide a structure and a way for districts to record the steps they take in developing an analytic plan. So it's really important that these are looked at and used and also can help frame discussions around what those data are. So this worksheet guides the following discussion with the team, which standardized assessments align with guidance in the module, when those standardized assessments would be conducted post-COVID-19, if there are any concerns with the quality or completeness of the data, how the district would go about validating those data. And then once that's completed, the toolkit guides the district back to the analytic plan, worksheet 1A. So Cora, if you go to the next slide. So you go back here, and now the district can list the outcomes that they're going to look at and the sources for those data. Okay, all right, you go to the next slide. Now, this is a very important note. So if the district determines that they do not have standardized assessment data that they can look at to conduct this analysis, this is a critical point on the district decision tree. If they don't have those data, they will not move forward in this module. So significant concerns about data quality will point them to continue to module 4, which we'll talk about later on in this webinar. But districts with sufficient quality data will continue on with module 2. So a key decision point here on the tree. Oh, I see a comment in the chat about where to find the worksheets. They are in the toolkit. Dom was going to re-upload it, and they're hyperlinked throughout, but they're in the back of the toolkit in the appendices. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so for those districts that can continue on in Module 2, meaning that they have standardized assessment data that they can work with, the toolkit next aids districts in evaluating additional data to include in their analysis. And the reason that you want to do this is, and we've alluded to this before with thinking about differences, there may be differential patterns in learning changes that exist for different groups of students or different schools or classroom settings. And so then the district or the toolkit guides districts in thinking about those additional data. Okay, next slide, Cora. So the toolkit aids users in thinking about student characteristics to include, and included some in the toolkit. We've included some example student factors here. So age, gender, English learner students, students in foster care, homeless youth, remote learners. This is not exhaustive. These are just some examples that districts might start thinking about as they think about what groups might be of interest given the district community context. To consider decisions for resource allocation that could be informed by analyzing different student groups. And if there might be any reasons to prioritize different student groups for analysis. And then next slide. Similarly, the toolkit aids the user in thinking about classroom and school characteristics that they might want to include or look at different patterns. And so again, we've listed some examples here in the toolkit and on this slide, percentage of students who are white, percentage of students who are economically disadvantaged, et cetera. Again, not an exhaustive list, and your district might have a particular setting or characteristic or group of schools that they want to, look at in particular. So again, what's of interest given the specific district and community context? Does this have any implications for resource allocation, or are there any reasons to prioritize different characteristics for analysis? And here I just want to re-emphasize that the toolkit is really set up to prompt users to have these discussions and think through this and really think through clearly to go about conducting these analyses and yeah, get those juices flowing to have them really think this through. Okay, so we're gonna have another activity. So if you could please go ahead and use the chat box to reflect on the part of the module that we just discussed and share any school or student characteristics that you think might be of interest you support.
I would add, or characteristics you think that districts should be interested in when doing this analysis.
Good point, Tom. Yeah. Yeah, and that you might recommend too, because you of course have a great knowledge of the context of the districts that you support.
Feel free to share your thoughts in the chat box or also unmute as well if you'd like to speak up. So it looks like we have a couple of thoughts. Disproportionate data coming soon, that might be an area for districts to consider. Several people mentioned students with disabilities, and particularly with the virtual learning environment, economically disadvantaged students as well. Type of instruction, whether students are learning online and kind of split off from that, whether it's self-paced learning or learning with the class online versus face-to-face. And someone mentioned English learner students as well. And gifted students as well. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Well, sounds like people are really starting to think about those different characteristics that they'd like to think about, and it's going to be a great conversation to have with your districts as they get through to this part of the toolkit. Oh yeah, synchronous, I have such struggle saying that word. Synchronous instruction versus asynchronous instruction. Of course, that's great, yeah. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so like with the standardized assessment data, the toolkit also aids users in conducting an inventory of the additional data they may want to use in their analyses. So this is worksheet 1D, and so it has users list the source of the data, the items of interest, when the data are available, and again, doing that assessment of quality concerns, and they can reference that slide that we had on those validation checks earlier on in the toolkit in the standardized assessment section to do those same types of checks on these other data that may be available. And then the toolkit instructs users to return to their analytical framework, which is worksheet 1A, to list the additional factors and their data sources. So next slide, Cora. And here you see that there is a box to list key factors to consider in worksheet 1A. Turn back to Cora.
Thank you so much, Susan. So before you wrap up Module 2, you'll want to complete worksheets 1B, 1C, and 1D that are in that Planning for Analysis workbook. And then, kind of working through the tree with the districts to figure out where they are and what the next module would be. Great, so just want to pause here and see if anyone has any questions about Module 2.
It doesn't look like anything's coming in.
Okay. Thank you, Dom. Yeah, so as always, please feel free to share questions in the chat boxes as we go along if something comes to mind later as well. So you may find yourself, as a next step, working towards Module 3, which is conducting analyses and interpreting findings. And so before beginning this module, as you're working with the district, you'll want to have completed modules 1 and 2. So this is something that follows from module 2. You may remember earlier on there was kind of a split point where some districts might be going back to module 4 and thinking about that more kind of qualitative piece. But if you're gonna be kind of working through module 3, this is really focused on that quantitative analysis and findings. So this kind of follows there from module 2. So if you, before you kind of dive into this module, you want to make sure you've completed modules 1 and 2 and that you've landed at this point 15 here. And again, in the RDL decision tree, it's a little bit of a different number, so that's point 13. And I will turn it over to Susan to walk through the module.
Thank you, Cora. Okay, so Module 3 of the toolkit can be used by a district once they determine their research questions and identify their data. Module 3 helps the user conduct their analysis and interpret findings. So specifically, Module 3 guides the user in the following steps: deciding on an analytical approach and then interpreting their findings. The resources used in the module are our district decision tree. In the Planning for Analysis workbook, worksheet 1A, which they will continue to fill out and complete in this module. And then their completed worksheets 1B through 1D to help in formulating their analytical work. And again, those are their plan for assessment as well as their inventory of data. And then they're actually going to use a different workbook, which is the Planning for Action workbook, worksheet 2A, which is a launch pad for next steps after conducting these analyses. Okay, next slide, Cora. Okay, so the toolkit first provides guidance for districts to think about deciding what they would constitute as a meaningful learning change. So as we know, there can always be variation in scores from year to year, and that might be anticipated variation. So what would a district think about as a learning change that would trigger an action such as differential resources or looking into something further? So this is the first question. So a district might consider any decline from the previous year or a difference from the projected trend as a meaningful or actionable learning change. Or they might have a threshold in mind that's reasonable given their knowledge of the standardized assessments and outcomes across time. They might also use a different logic. So I encourage you all to think about how you might frame this discussion with the districts you support and kind of help them think back through what is meaningful in terms of a learning change. And then the toolkit instructs users to return to their analytic framework in worksheet 1A to list this threshold for a meaningful learning change. We have that on the next slide. So there it is there. We're almost done with worksheet 1A. So it's down there at the bottom in the analytical approach and meaningful learning change column. Okay, next slide. And then the toolkit next prompts users to think about the kind of analytic approach that makes sense given the data and analytic capacity of the district. So it provides a table with a comparison between a more simple approach and an approach that requires a higher level of analytic capacity. So an example is a means comparison, which does not require a high level of statistical expertise. You can observe trends and make comparisons pre and post COVID-19. And you can also isolate the means comparison to look at specific populations and compare means for different populations. And then this more advanced approach would be a longitudinal model, and that requires a higher level of statistical expertise, but you can estimate student learning in the presence of an absence of COVID-19. So you can create that projected trend and look at that compared to what you actually see. And then looking at the relationship for each factor of interest, so for example, student race ethnicity, while controlling for all factors in the model. So also controlling for eligibility for free or reduced price lunch, for example. And it's important when you're considering the approach to also consider the drawbacks of each approach. So for example, a simple means comparison might not control for important variables. You know, you can keep cutting it down to more specific groups of students, but just keeping in mind the drawbacks of that approach and being thoughtful of that when you're thinking about the results of your analysis. And here I encourage you to think about where each district you work with might fall in their level of statistical expertise. So you kind of have a sense of that already, and where you kind of might guide districts to go, and when they're considering which analytical approach to take. And then we just have, you know, a warning in here that neither option provides causal inferences, just to remind districts and the users to think about when they are thinking through their results, what does that really mean, and being careful about the language that they use. Okay, next slide. So the toolkit next guides users through a brainstorming activity around selecting an analytic approach. So discussing their options, which methodology aligns with their research questions, pointing them back to their analytical framework in the end to list the details of their analytic approach. And we have that on the next slide. So there you are. So this is an example of a very generalized, complete worksheet 1A. All right, so next slide, please. All right, so we're now going to have another activity where we're going to go back into small groups and we're going to discuss the following questions. So you're going to use maybe that same district you discussed in the first breakout activity, or, you know, if you're thinking of all your districts, to discuss the following questions. What analytic approach might be most suitable for this district? How might you improve their capacity, if needed, to do more complicated statistical analysis? How would you frame the discussion of a meaningful learning change for estimating loss? And what kinds of considerations might you pose to help districts think through that threshold? But before we do send out into breakout rooms again, we'll give you just a moment to jot down some initial responses. And again, the questions will be in the chat box. You carry them with you over into your small group. And also they are in that same Google document, and the links in the chat box listed out. So you can also click there, just so you don't have to rapidly jot down the questions. But we'll go ahead and give you a minute just to think through some initial responses.
Sorry, I posted the wrong questions in the chat box. The bottom questions are the ones for your breakout sessions. Apologies.
Okay, I think, Cora, we can go ahead and send folks.
Great, so we'll send everyone to your breakout rooms. And again, if you have any technical issues or anything, just feel free to send me a chat message. Hi, Lynn. Hi, Christopher. It looks like you're still in the main room, so just wanted to check in and see, did you get a pop-up message or an invitation to join a breakout room? Hi, Lynn. Just let me know if you have any technical issues or if you weren't able to join the breakout session.
some qualitative data.
Hi, welcome back, everyone. I think we're just waiting for one or two more folks to come back from the breakout session. And then we'll do a quick share out like we did for the last activity as well. I think we can go ahead and get started. So I'll start, actually, let's go in the opposite order this time. So I'll start with the group from Breakout Room 7. So we had Kathy, Charles, and Jackie in this room. Would anyone like to share some takeaways about analytic approaches that might be appropriate and or the meaningful threshold kind of thought and conversation you had?
This is Jackie, and I'll start. If anyone else in the group wants to chime in, please do. I think what we talked about a lot was that our role, especially in this step, because I think the verbiage and the language gets a little technical here, that our role would be to really kind of help overlay this on top of maybe a process that the district is already using. So we have a lot of processes. And in essence, the processes are typically the same. They just use different wording, they use different language, but the process itself of asking a question, finding the data, looking at the evidence, creating a plan, the process is essentially the same. So I think our role is going to be to help them overlay this on top of maybe what is already working for them in terms of a process, so that it isn't one more thing on their table, but something to support and supplement.
That's a wonderful takeaway. Thank you so much, Jackie. And that's a really good reminder that districts might be familiar with some of the processes, but you know, and maybe they'd be kind of ready to jump in, but they just need a little bit of help kind of mapping it to some of the technical pieces and the terms that are being used as well. That's great. Great. Would anyone from group 6 like to chime in? So we had Christine, Christopher, Christy, and Lonnie in this group.
I can share for our group again. We talked about something pretty similar to Jackie's group, and just being aware and careful at our language. And I've done research before. I've engaged in it, but it can appear very sterile, let's say. So we have to really ensure that, again, like Jackie said, we have these other processes happening in the district. How can we bring them back to that? Or what are you noticing? What are you wondering? And kind of connecting that back to making good decisions for students. And I think we're just gonna have to be really careful with that. And let's see here, I wanna make sure. I mean, we didn't really get to all of those questions, but that was kind of the focus. And we also talked about the importance of the data validity, because I think, you know, we're having some issues right now with COVID, with students testing at home and with this and that. You know, there's some differences there that we're going to have to acknowledge. And then also to, it could be before COVID even hit that we have some data quality concerns. You know, we talked about in our group about the secure data center, things like that, you know, districts understanding what data is there. Is it really accurate? Is it, you know, really giving an accurate picture of what's really happening in your district? Are you reporting things correctly? Are you, you know, we feel like we may even need to take some back steps to those things, which I know isn't here in this module, but
But it's definitely a helpful consideration, Christy, and I think it will be helpful, to have that kind of framing in mind as we one day hopefully will enter a post-COVID space, and as you're thinking about ways to keep supporting your districts and making sure that they are collecting really meaningful data. And it's a nice tie back, I think, to the first conversation we had where a lot of people shared thoughts about the reliability and the validity of the data that we're getting in COVID-19. So that is helpful as well. Thank you so much, Christy. So in group 5, we had Cheryl, Lynn, Mindy, Summer, and Susan. Would anyone like to share a little bit about what you discussed?
I'll jump on. We really spent our time talking about the meaningful threshold for loss, and we're kind of mapping it to like the MAP or the STAR benchmarks and what would be a comparison, and thinking of like in normal pre-COVID land, if someone took the winter benchmark and then compared it to the fall benchmark, what learning typically would occur, and then look at the last benchmark they took and their first benchmark this year, and just to kind of compare what normal used to be and where we're at now to kind of identify what that meaningful threshold could be for your district. And so that was an interesting conversation.
Absolutely, Mindy. And it sounds like using that kind of comparison to the tests and the way that districts might measure their thresholds normally, like that would be a kind of good way for districts to wrap their heads around this and starting to assess kind of what meaningful changes may have happened. That's great. Great. Would anyone from group 4 like to chime in? In that group, we had Dan, Lisa, and Ray.
I can share. One of the things that we discussed was unfortunately, at this point, a lack of data that our districts are currently struggling under. We've banked on receiving state assessment data for a number of years, but now that it's gone, what do we have to tell us about our students? And we have places that just don't have it. And so that kind of became part of our conversation is, for those that have it, that's great. Do they have a longitudinal data component? Because it may have changed. They may have only been doing it, for a short amount of time, which doesn't give them the longevity, needed to do this type of work, while others simply don't have it. So now we need to plan for that. So that's kind of a basis of our conversation.
And I think that's a very timely point too, because the next couple of modules we'll talk about, the next one is talking about different kinds of data collection if you don't have if you don't have that assessment data or you don't have the longitudinal data, there are still questions that can be answered using different data collection methods, and hopefully this toolkit can be a resource for that. And as a preview, our last module, we'll kind of talk about the next steps in an action plan, whether you're using this quantitative data or the more qualitative data. So I think that's a really good point too, that districts may not be in a place to kind of go through that learning assessment data, or they may not have the same quality of data, but hopefully there'll be resources to help districts still collect some information as well. Great. So in group 3, we had April, Coy, Gary, and Peggy. Would anyone like to share their thoughts from your discussion?
I can share. We also talked mostly about that meaningful threshold and how to actually get in and start, have the districts kind of buy into this, because there's just so much that they have going on, and thinking about everything that they're doing, this kind of falls to the bottom. But we talked about focusing on kind of finding data that shows where there may be losses last year from previous years, and helping districts kind of see where those data pieces lie. And Peggy reminded us to make sure that we are actually looking at the data and not just making assumptions about yes, there are learning losses in these groups, but actually finding the data to support to support our assumptions or to negate them. And then really kind of focusing on helping districts, teachers specifically, know that we can't be, even though we want to get back to normal, we just can't do education as normal as we've done it in the past. We have to really focus on the needs of the students that we have in our classrooms and use the data to go from where they are forward.
Thank you, April. Yeah, those are fantastic points around the framing, making sure that the districts are using the data and really kind of looking at what's actually happening there. And then, like you said, being responsive to the needs of their students. You know, virtual learning and even as, you know, things kind of transition back into in-person learning, it comes with a whole variety of challenges. So it's not necessarily just kind of back to normal. And so it's definitely important to help the districts kind of see that and see where they may need to adjust or kind of look more closely at what's happening as well. Great. So what about group 2? So we had Brittany, Kathleen, Kathy, and Mark and Mike in this breakout room. Would anyone like to share a little bit about your discussion?
Because I could share, one of the things we talked about pretty extensively is the, in some cases, lack of capacity in the district, especially in small districts, to lead this discussion at a little bit of a higher level in terms of determining a reasonable threshold to consider and all the factors that have been presented here as we look at the data. We, similar to other groups, talked about, in some cases, the lack of data, but we also talked about that whole notion of being able to have someone lead that discussion and assure that all the considerations that you're laying out for us here are part of the discussion, and that we just aren't jumping to conclusions based on our expectations for what will look different about this data. We also realize that because there's a constant turnover in many districts in leadership, personnel changes cause us to have to, many times when we begin data discussions, go back to the very basics and teach once again the basics about data literacy that may not be in the backgrounds of the people coming to the table in these discussions. So those are the types of things we talked about. Anybody else from our group want to join in?
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing those thoughts. And those are definitely places where the RDLs can really be a strong support for the districts and making sure that they're looking at the data and also providing that consistency since there is turnover as well. Great. And last but certainly not least, we'll go to group 1. So we had Heather, Janice, Lisa, Matthew, and Tom in this group. Would anyone like to share some takeaways?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and speak. I apologize, I didn't have my mute on for the last few minutes, so hopefully I wasn't making noise over here. No, we had some really good discussions. We talked about, you know, when it comes to data, and all the districts are in different places, but we did talk about the restart readiness assessments and maybe using those to get some data. Using the data, having the students take the assessment from the previous year to see where they're at, comparison. We threw around some of the ideas of, you know, just having open communication amongst the teachers. It's okay to tell them that you didn't get somewhere. You know, we do have gap analysis documents, but just general discussions that show where you were, what you were able to accomplish. And the other thing we discussed, and you talk about the estimating of loss. And I know this has been brought up in other meetings that many of us have been on, or maybe you just talked about in your district, but making sure that the teachers are not trying to go back and reteach if you're a 5th grade teacher, don't try to teach the last fourth quarter of 4th grade. You need to be teaching your standards of the grade level that you are in. You may have to do a lot more scaffolding and supporting, but if your teacher is going backwards and trying to reteach last year to catch students up, you're actually going to start making that gap bigger and that loss bigger. And so then if you start collecting data, are you collecting data that showing loss because they lost it over the stay at home, or did you lose it because you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing in your job and being able to carry it on? Yeah. Thank you. That was actually from Janice, but I'll steal it. But yeah, so those are just some important things that we talked about. And I know many of you on this call, and we've talked many times, and you guys have wonderful things to say. And everything that everyone said is awesome. And I think if we can get that information pushed out to the schools and making sure that everybody's on the same page, you know, our students are more resilient than we are. And hopefully we can close this gap up and move forward sooner than later.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tom. And that's a good reminder for the districts you work with, too, that what they're doing and what's happening in the classroom can also mitigate, or it can, you know, make learning losses larger as well. So that might be a good place for you to kind of keep an eye on what the districts are doing and help support them in kind of planning what teachers should be doing, how much they should be scaffolding or kind of repeating from last year, but also making sure that students are really moving ahead and learning what they need to learn this year as well. Thank you all so much for thinking deeply about these questions and ways that you might be able to support your districts. And I'm going to turn it back over to Susan.
All right, thanks so much, Cora. Okay, so on the next slide, something that the toolkit does and that we thought was important is it provides an illustration of what it might look like for a district to use 2 different types of analysis to look at learning changes. So the toolkit provides an example of a means comparison and also an interrupted time series analysis, which is a more advanced statistical modeling approach. And so in this example, the districts use the same data, the same research questions about learning changes to look at their data and use these 2 different approaches. I want to emphasize strongly that these examples do not use real data. It's just a hypothetical illustration. In fact, I myself made these data up, so definitely not representative of a real district, but just more of an illustration to kind of show what the results might look like and also to show some examples of research questions and approach. Okay, so we can go on to the next slide. Okay, so here, we're going to go with the first example, and that's a district that chose to conduct a means comparison analysis. Okay, so I'll walk through, this is a fully completed worksheet 1A, an analytic framework. The research questions that this district chose to ask were, how has students' learning changed on the district mathematics assessment post-COVID-19 for their first research question? And then for their second research question, they asked, do student learning changes vary for students who are economically disadvantaged compared with students who are not economically disadvantaged? So again, this is just an example, and your districts may choose to look at this population or other populations, but example district was very focused on the differences between economically disadvantaged and non-economically disadvantaged students. And then for their standardized assessments, they looked at outcomes on their mathematics standardized assessment. Again, just an example, does not have to be a math assessment, could be more than one assessment. And I just want to note here too, that just for illustrative purposes, this district chose to standardize their data to have a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1. Again, not necessary. You could use raw scores, you could use some other scale. Just an example, and they listed out their data source. So they actually have data for the standardized assessment each fall, and they administered the test in the fall of 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, and 2019 for pre-COVID, and then also in the fall of 2020 for post-COVID. Again, just an example, and I'll keep emphasizing that just to say that we really just wanted to set this up as one illustration. And again, there are key factors to consider. They're looking at student economic disadvantage status, and they got that from their district administrative records. So they're using a means comparison in this first example, and they decided that a meaningful learning change was 0.1 standard deviation. And again, the reason that this is framed in terms of standard deviation is because they have standardized their assessment to have a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1. So that's what their results are going to come out as standard deviation changes. But again, you could use any meaningful learning change. You could use a point change on a raw scale. You could look at an effect size, etc. But this is just the example that they chose. And then they ran their analysis. Okay, next slide, Cora. So this, the toolkit then shows what a means comparison table might reveal in terms of research question 1, and that's here on the screen. So again, their first research question was, how has student learning changed on the district mathematics assessment post-COVID-19? And they're just looking at means across all students. And so they see over here in the mean score that the mean score has actually been increasing up to fall of 2019. And you see that in the change from previous year column. However, in the fall of 2020, it fell, and it actually fell by 0.42 standard deviation. So looking at the means, they do see that there was a learning change, and it was a negative learning change post-COVID-19. Okay, next slide. And so here, the toolkit shows what the means comparison table might reveal in terms of research question 2. So again, research question 2, do student learning changes vary for students who are economically disadvantaged compared with students who are not economically disadvantaged? So the analyst looked at the mean score just for those students who were not economically disadvantaged, and that's the 2 columns on the left there. And then also the means for students who are economically disadvantaged. And so for both groups, the mean score was actually increasing over time from fall 2015 through fall 2019. And you'll notice that in fall 20, the mean score fell for both groups, but you can see that it fell further for those students who are economically disadvantaged. So here we do see that learning changes differed for the economically disadvantaged group compared with students who are not economically disadvantaged. And also that the 0.28 and the 0.56, those are actually both meaningful learning changes according to the district's threshold of 0.1, but one is significantly larger than the other. Okay, so we'll go to the next slide. All right, so now the toolkit presents an example of a district that chose to use this interrupted time series approach as their methodological approach. You'll note here in their analytical framework worksheet 1A that it looks very similar to the means comparison framework. Same research questions, same standardized assessments, same key factors that you consider, but where it differs here is in the methodological approach box. So they're doing an IPS analysis, and then it provides some further notes on the statistical model. So this model is going to control for a series of student, classroom, and school level characteristics beyond just the key factors that they wanted to consider. It also includes a variable to represent time, which increases in single unit intervals for each month included in the study period. And then it includes an indicator variable equal to 1 for times that occur post-COVID-19 and 0 otherwise. And in this example, there's only 1 time that occurred post-COVID-19. And then it also includes an interaction term between the COVID-19 variable and the indicator variable equal to 1 if a student was eligible for free or reduced price lunch, and equal to 0 otherwise. And that's how, in this example, they were defining economically disadvantaged students, but that could have a different definition depending on the district's context.
And they chose to look at the same meaningful learning change of 0.1 standard deviation. Okay, so the next slide shows what a chart of the results from an ITS analysis might reveal in terms of research question 1. And so what this does is it plots estimates on the chart. It provides some notes about how it does that. And so what you can see with this ITS approach is you can see this trend over time from fall 2015 through fall 2019. And that's where, you know, this is the pre-COVID-19 trend. That's where we have actual data pre-COVID-19. And then this dotted line goes up to the estimated pre-COVID-19. If you use that pre-COVID-19 trend, the estimated place where students would be post-COVID-19. But then it also plots where the estimate shows them post-COVID-19 using that data. And you can see that there is a difference between the estimated place where they would be on this pre-COVID-19 trend and then where the model estimate has them post-COVID-19. And you can see that there's a change, a learning change of 0.25 standard deviation, all else being equal, post-COVID-19. So again, the district observed, even controlling for other variables, that there was a learning change post-COVID-19, and using their meaningful learning threshold, it was meaningfully different, greater than 0.1 standard deviation. Okay, next slide. So then we look at this for students who are economically disadvantaged versus students who are not economically disadvantaged. And again, this is research question 2. Do learning changes vary between these two groups of students? And so what this does is it plots 2 charts, one using estimates for students who are not economically disadvantaged and the other using estimates for students who are economically disadvantaged. And so you'll note again that you see pre-COVID-19 that both groups are on this increasing trajectory. And you can see where the model predicts they would have been if they stayed on that pre-COVID-19 trend in the fall of 2020, and then where the model estimates on average that they landed. And again, the main takeaway here is that though both groups did experience a learning change and a negative learning change, the learning change for students who were economically disadvantaged is larger than for students who are not economically disadvantaged, although the learning change in both cases exceeded that meaningfully different learning change that the district had decided on. Okay, so you can go to the next slide. So this toolkit prompts users to think about interpreting their results. And so we can go to the next slide. So what the toolkit does is first remind users of some of the important considerations when conducting these analyses. So these analyses cannot isolate the impact of school closures or the quality of remote learning after closures. They can't isolate other conflating circumstances, trauma that the student experienced, poverty, racial bias, job loss from school closures, those types of things. And that collecting data consistently and continuing to conduct analyses will reveal the trajectory of loss and any mitigation across time. So you might run the analyses for the first time point where you have standardized assessment data, run it later to check in. You still see these learning changes. Is there still loss, or is that kind of dissipating over time, either through what you're doing or, you know, I don't know anyone who wouldn't be doing anything, but is it just kind of petering out as students go back to school? So thinking about how you might want to incorporate this type of analysis over time to kind of keep track of where the district is in terms of learning changes since the incidence of COVID-19 in the spring of 2020. Okay, next slide. And then the toolkit provides a slide meant to guide discussion when interpreting findings. So prompting districts, well, do you observe an overall learning change? Do you observe learning changes for any student groups or in any school or classroom settings? And how do the sizes of the differential learning changes compare, and bringing back in that meaningful learning change that the district was using as well when they're considering that. And then on the next slide, the toolkit also provides an additional slide to prompt further reflection on the findings. So do the findings surprise you, or are they in line with your expectations? I know somebody spoke a little earlier about, that there are these assumptions that districts have potentially about where different student groups might be. Well, is that borne out in the data? Or are you seeing some differential effects where you wouldn't have expected to see them? What events or circumstances may have contributed to the differential learning changes you observe? Brainstorming around that, what might be going on there? What could be making the observed learning change greater or smaller? For example, might some students have more computing access or access to other supports? When you think about those, like, for example, when we talked about the economically disadvantaged students versus non-economically disadvantaged students, could there be something going on where there's an access to resource issue, something like that? And then identifying any additional research questions that were prompted by this analysis. Is there another student group you may want to go back and focus on? Or is there something you want to explore maybe in a different direction using a qualitative approach? So these are things that you can use worksheet 2A of the Planning for Action workbook to help guide you in those further analyses. And then finally, this slide prompts the user to go to point 16 on the district decision tree and think about those potential other analyses that you could explore with current data or through additional data collection efforts. Okay, go to the next slide. Turn it over to Cora.
Great, thank you so much, Susan. So building off of that, the next step would be looking at points 16 and 17, which is about potential additional research questions, and then working with the district to figure out what your potential next steps might be. So these are points 16 and 17 on the district tree. For the RDL decision tree, these are 13 and 15. Or I'm sorry, 14 and 15. I'm skipping my numbers. So before wrapping up Module 3, you'll just want to go through those steps and determine where the district is on the tree and figure out what your next steps will be. So again, we just wanted to pause here and see if anyone has questions about Module 3.
It doesn't look like there's any questions, Cora. I'm not seeing anything come through.
Okay. Thank you, Dom. So, of course, feel free to ask questions along the way if something comes up later on. And actually, we are running a little bit ahead of schedule, so we can actually take a 10-minute break here. So we'll pause for 10 minutes. Feel free to get up, check email, whatever you need to do. And we'll come back here in 10 minutes, which is 11:21. So we will see you soon. Hi all, we'll get started again in another minute or so. Great, welcome back everybody. We hope you enjoyed the break. So we have 2 more modules to walk through and these ones should be fairly quick. So we'll go through our modules 4 and 5. So module 4 is looking at complementary data collection activities and new activities. So as you'll see on the next slide, before you begin this module, you want to make sure that your research questions call for additional data collection. So we'll talk through some of the more qualitative data that you may be able to collect even if you don't have that quantitative, really strong assessment data there. And so, one thing to just point out here is that you may have come to this point by going through modules 1, 2, and 3 where you had that quantitative piece and then you want to collect additional data as well. Or this might be something where the district came here because they don't have as much of the quantitative data or maybe don't have the capacity to collect that. So there are multiple paths to get to module 4, but either way there's still information that your district can collect to learn a little bit more about those learning changes post-COVID. So you'll want to make sure that the district landed on either point 10 or point 19, which will direct them to module 4 here. And then the RDL tree, those would be points 8 or 17. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dom to talk through the modules.
Okay, thank you so much, Cora. So as Cora said, module 4 is meant to be either a standalone module or it's meant to be used in combination with modules 1 through 3. So this module really provides some considerations and parameters for additional data collection. Walks you through developing a plan if your district does decide that they want to move forward with understanding sort of needs and the kinds of research questions that this kind of data collection can answer. So in this module, you will again be using the district decision tree, as Cora just went through, and also the planning for action workbook, which is in the next appendix. So I believe it's appendix 3, Cora or Susan, correct me if I'm wrong, or C, maybe. Worksheet 2A, that's for districts that have completed modules 1 through 3, and then worksheet 2D, that's if you haven't completed the steps for quantitative analysis and you're hopping right to module 4. Right, next slide. And again, these are all hyperlinked in that toolkit. So if you even just go to the front couple of slides in your toolkit, you'll be able to navigate right to both the workbooks and to module 4. So module 4 covers new data collection activities and primarily qualitative data collection activities. So surveys, interviews, and focus groups with staff, students, district families. So this is also recognizing that new data collection can require some resource investment, some additional resource investment. It can also provide a wealth of knowledge for districts to better understand the experiences or the needs that are happening in their district and really give a better scope or lay of the land. If they've already completed modules 1 through 3 and they have some idea of where learning changes are happening, it can provide additional context. Why are those learning changes happening? What are the experiences that are leading up to or surrounding these learning changes that we're seeing with specific groups? Okay, next slide, please. So there's sort of 3 different categories that this kind of data collection can encapsulate. So questions that seek to understand experiences of either students or teachers or families or even administrators in your district to help aid us in making decisions in terms of support or areas of need. And then that brings us to needs sensing. So are students, feeling like they're adequately prepared for remote learning in terms of technology? So all sorts of needs sensing. Are families able to feed themselves? Are there basic needs that aren't being met? And then in terms of having extant data and doing a quantitative analysis, so are there further questions that are coming from that can't be answered within that extant data set? Next slide. So we wanted to, in the toolkit, just provide a couple of examples of these types of questions. So adding context to the quantitative analysis of COVID-19 learning changes, post-COVID-19 learning changes. So one example would be, We've done our means comparison. We've seen that our group of students who are economically disadvantaged are doing far worse than our students who are not defined as being economically disadvantaged. Why is that happening? What are their experiences, and what are the contributing factors? We want to understand this better. So that's something that can be well addressed by a qualitative approach. And then providing needed information when it's not available in that administrative data. So for example, and I think this is a big question on all districts' minds, how did students experience that remote instruction in spring of 2020? That might help you better understand why you see a dip in scores or why you see learning changes, or even why if there's learning changes for one group but not so much for the other, it can help you also better understand what parameters might be surrounding that. And then providing a fundamental understanding of needs. And this is really something that can be done at any point in the year and even beyond COVID. So the qualitative approach is a really great tool for needs sensing. So example, how many families experiencing housing or food insecurities in our district. Not only does that help us understand learning changes, but it also helps us understand where we might need additional resources throughout the district. Okay, next slide. So this is by no means an extensive guidelines to how to conduct these, but we wanted to give some basic best practices and fundamental questions to ask yourself if you want to employ some of these new data collection activities. So we start with talking about some of the parameters around surveys. Surveys can be a really great resource. They can be easy to deploy. They can be done electronically, although I will note something to consider is that if you are administering surveys electronically via email, you're not going to capture information from most families that don't have those resources and don't have access to email or internet or know how to use those. Surveys are really useful, and this is a strong caution. Surveys are really useful when you have an understanding of what you might find. So if you put together a survey and you find that a lot of your questions, the only response categories you have might be open-ended, you might want to consider interviews or focus groups as a start. So in order to have a survey that provides you with good data, good information that's reliable, remember that the survey taker, one, has to understand the question. So the language use of your survey is very important. And I will say also language translation for those that have students and families that speak multiple languages. Of course, you're gonna get better data if everything is translated into the appropriate languages and translated correctly. So that's another consideration. And also your response categories have to be definitive. So by that I mean, if you've developed a survey, you want to go through and make sure that your response categories are you're not able to answer in the same question in multiple response categories, because that's not telling you as much. So you might not have as good of a handle on what is actually going on, and you might want to go over to interviews and focus groups to get a little broader perspective. So again, surveys, some questions that are great that can be answered. Ranking, how do students feel their remote experience? Was it adequate or was it not? Or was it in the middle? How do teachers perceive moving to remote learning? And again, this is a caveat. So if you have an idea of how your teachers might have been perceiving it, you can come up with response categories. But if it's pretty vague, you might want to do some interviews or focus groups first with a small subset of teachers and then build a survey once you have a better understanding. So I should back up and say that these types of methodologies can actually be built on top of each other. So doing a subset of interviews and focus groups can really give you a better understanding to design a survey. So last example, were provisions of technological support sufficient for students to participate in remote learning? So the response categories in those would be pretty obvious. Yes, they were. No, they weren't. We have additional feedback. Okay, next slide, please. So interviews and focus groups are the other kinds of qualitative data collection that are easier for districts to carry out. Great part about it is, and I'll go through this in a second too, is that a small sample size still provides really good data. So it's not like you have to go out and do focus groups and interviews with absolutely everybody. So that does sort of mitigate some of the time that is invested in this. Interviews and focus groups as a data collection method are really most appropriate when you want to understand things in a really deep context. They allow you to ask more open-ended questions. They allow you to ask questions as you're doing the focus groups and interviews. If you're finding that there's things that you're not expecting, it allows you to probe more. So that thick description of what people are experiencing, feeling, what their needs are, this is a great methodology to employ. So some of the additional questions that can be answered, these are just examples again. What were the experiences of students and families during the COVID-19 school closures? To get a better idea of I hate to bring it to the negative, but sort of what kind of traumas students and families might be experiencing that feed into their learning, and what kind of resources they were looking for or what kind of resources they need. And that can help in considerations for resource allocation for districts in the future. What kinds of professional development and support do teachers need to feel proficient in remote learning? This question is something I would never ask in a survey. This is very appropriate for focus groups or interviews because it really opens the door for those perspectives to come out, and the unique individual perspectives to come out together. How did school administrators respond to the school closures, and what kind of support do they need in the future? Again, really broad questions that can allow you for a really deep understanding of what's actually happened on the ground. And I will say, for interviews and focus groups, it's not in the toolkit, but another caveat I would give is that interviews are really key when there's some sort of power dynamic, or maybe there's some sort of hesitancy to share. Marginal groups or groups who are experiencing trauma, you never really want to put them in a focus group. You want to do an individual interviews. Individual interviews, even though they don't allow for complete anonymity, they allow for more sort of anonymity and protection in the space of giving the interview. Focus groups are really great to consider if you think the dynamic between the group would actually improve your understanding. So for instance, the professional development question with teachers, I would certainly bring teachers into a room and then let them generate that conversation together and bounce ideas off of each other. But when it comes to something like what did families experience and what kind of resources they need, that's never something I would do in a focus group, because you have all those other sort of considerations of their experiences and protecting the individuals that you're doing research with. Okay. Next slide. So this is really just a simple table to sort of reflect on what are the considerations that you should take into mind as you're leading your districts through thinking about doing additional data collection. So surveys, pros, absolutely can be easily administered online, again with that caveat that your families that don't have resources or access to that, you won't get information from them. Surveys are anonymous. That is also great. It allows people the space to actually be open and honest about their responses. And ensuring their anonymity is really important, even if that's through de-identifying data once you get it back. And data collection can be automated. So using something like SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics easily allows you to gather up that data and makes analysis much, much quicker. And data, as I just said, data analysis can be easy. You can look at means, you can look at trends. This isn't really a complex statistical tool in the way that I'm thinking about it, or the way that we thought about it in this toolkit. This is by no means sort of what Susan was talking about earlier, but it does give you an open window onto the perceptions and experiences for your district. Cons, as far as surveys go, really limited in the depth of information that's gathered. So unlike interviews and focus groups, you're sort of reduced to what your questions are. And again, surveys with a lot of open-ended questions, I would encourage you to look towards interview and focus groups first. So your response categories should be predefined, your language should be aligned with those that are taking the survey. Surveys don't allow you the opportunity for follow-up questions. So again, it sort of limits that depth that you can get from the data. And then interviews and focus groups, the pros are definitely that depth of information, the ability to ask further questions. interviews and focus groups can provide a rich quality of understanding, even with a small amount of participants. And there's an opportunity to probe participant responses if there's something that you didn't expect. The cons are definitely that it is time consuming. And there is a certain, I think, finesse that should be employed when doing interviews and focus groups to, again, allow those participants sort of the space to have that anonymity and be able to openly share. So you want to think about also power dynamics, who's collecting the data. And it can be time consuming. Here I say coding and analyzing and transcription. This is really another level of analysis that you might not even need to employ. You could definitely do interviews and focus groups and just sort of take the recordings and summarize what you've seen and your themes into a memo, and then use that to supplement decision making. Next slide, please. So in our toolkit, we again have some of these great worksheets. So worksheets 2A and 2D in the Planning for Action workbook are useful in Module 4. So 2A you'll use to refine those research questions, and I'll go through that in a second. And then determine what kind of data collection activity might be most appropriate given the considerations that we outline in the toolkit. And the worksheet 2D sort of puts a framework around what kind of planning needs to happen and go in place or should go in place before conducting data collection activities. Next slide. So in the chat box, we would love it if you responded to either of these questions. So do you know if any of your districts are doing interviews, focus groups, or surveys currently? We'd love for you to share in those. And I also welcome you to come on screen and talk about it as well. And can you see your districts employing some of these methods? I've heard a lot of concern, especially with these smaller districts that might not have the quality or capacity to do the quantitative analysis. So are these methods something that you think might be valuable or useful to your districts? And I'll let Cora summarize responses.
So as Dom mentioned, feel free to put your thoughts in the chat box. Oh, perfect. It looks like we have a thought from Lonnie here. So she says surveys have been done about parents and students' experiences with online learning. And feel free to hop on webcam as well, if you'd like to chime in.
I did not think they were good. So we actually had discussed sharing maybe some potential survey questions that have been developed internally. So that's certainly something we can put on our list of resources to follow up with.
This is Tom. That would be great if you could share some of those. I do feel sometimes that the surveys, you kind of know what the answers are going to be when they set them up. I found sometimes that the survey was set up to where it was almost guiding someone. And I don't think it was on purpose. It was more after you had the survey and looked at the data that you realized, huh, that really didn't get what we were getting at. You made a good point. The electronic version, I love. A little bit of a tree hugger with the paper, but you are only going to get, I guess, on the electronic version, the family that is over involved and the family that wants to tell you why they should be over involved. You're missing the ones that I think we really need to get to. And I am going to put a shout out that you talked about the ELs. Person in my office would be very happy to say that you mentioned that, because that's a growing population in many of our areas, and they're the ones that we really need to get an understanding about. And so I think that was a good point. So if you have some, I think that would be great, because we've talked about surveys in many districts, and like I said, I feel like they're good until you get the data and realize they really were not.
Yeah, absolutely. We would, we'll definitely put that on our list to share. And Tom, you make a great point. That's a common flaw in surveys, is that they do, like, if they're not well designed, they will guide people towards the answers, or they're unintelligible to those that are taking them. One technique that actually doesn't take a ton of time that I would recommend if you're going to design your own survey is to actually maybe pull together, even if it's some of those over-involved parents, but have them take the survey before you widely administer it and just see what they think about the language, get some reflections from them on like, was it guiding? Is there different ways to phrase this? So that's just a quick like QA check you can do if you're designing your own surveys. Yes, we'll definitely put that on our list. Okay, sorry, Cora, sorry, I'll let you go ahead and summarize.
No, that's helpful. We do have a few other thoughts in the chat box. So Susan mentioned that many districts did online surveys and used focus groups to help shape their restart plans. Jackie mentioned that surveys have been used for collecting qualitative data. And Kathleen also mentioned that some districts use surveys and focus groups starting back in the spring to plan for kind of the fall reopening in that plan as well.
I would actually love, I'm not gonna put anybody on the spot because I don't like that either, but I would love anybody who was involved with focus groups or surveys, if you can just come on screen real quick and talk about how was it useful, any lessons learned?
I will say a few words. I was not a part of a focus group. I have only heard from the couple of districts that I know use them, where they brought in all stakeholders, including teachers, parents. I'm not sure of any students, unless maybe our high school did that, but they just brought those groups together and tried to collect, again, qualitative data around what would be best for the restart. And they had several meetings throughout the summer to put those plans together.
Very cool. Yeah, and again, some considerations on focus groups and like bringing in a wide swath of stakeholders, I think is fantastic. Something that we do in our qualitative research is just ensuring that those groups are somewhat heterogeneous. No, homogeneous, sorry. Heterogeneous is the wrong word. Homogeneous. So pairing parents with parents and teachers with teachers and students with students. That's great to hear that they've been doing that. Anybody else like to share? And we'll also see if we can find some good interview questions, particularly around COVID-19 school closures. So we'll see if we can share that as well.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much, Dom. And feel free if other thoughts come up or you know something comes to mind, you know that someone's been using surveys or focus groups or interviews, feel free to share that in the chat box as well. So what happens next after you look at these complementary data activities? So the next step will be moving to Module 5 to develop a dissemination plan and identify any resources that are needed to start acting on that and kind of sharing information as well. So we'll just take a quick pause here to see if anyone has questions about the complementary data collection activities in Module 4. Thank you, Susan. So I don't see any questions at the moment, but as Susan mentioned, feel free to share them in the chat box. So we'll move on to our last module, which is looking at additional research questions, your dissemination plan, and identifying any additional resources that are needed to move forward. So before beginning this module, you'll want to make sure that the district is ready to share findings from both the quantitative or qualitative data collection, depending on what you used. And that you've landed on point 20 at the district decision tree. So a lot of points will come to this place, and on the RDL tree, it's going to be point 18. So just as kind of a reminder, you'll want to have findings from either your extant data analysis or any new data collection that your district has done, whether it's quantitative or qualitative. And then this is the point where you'd be ready to kind of share and act on those findings. And I'm going to turn it over to Dom to talk through this module.
Okay, thanks, Cora. Okay, so Module 5 is really intended for, as Cora was saying, districts that have some data to share, have some findings, and are ready to sort of either move on to the next step or consider what the next steps are. So that might be additional data collection, that might be more analysis, or it might be who do we share this with and how can this be impactful. And then also identifying needs and needed support. I want to emphasize that Module 5 is really just meant to be this sort of starting point of thinking. It's not meant to be a full guide to the next steps for districts. So it's really just a starting bounce point. So resources for this module really rely on the Planning for Action workbook. That's the second workbook in the toolkit. So worksheets 2A through 2C. Next slide. So after completing your analysis, this module walks you through going back to your original research questions and then sort of stepping through what did you find and what additional questions do you have? Now what next steps are best in terms of data collection or additional data analysis. Also generating new questions from the finding as well, and recording all of these in a worksheet. Again, the worksheets are really meant to be a guide for districts and a way for them to structure the recording of sort of how the process happens. Next slide. Yep, next slide. Okay, thanks. So this is an example of a filled out worksheet. A filled out worksheet 2A in the Planning for Action workbook. So we can see this sample district. They started out, again, these are referring to the analysis that Susan presented a little bit ago in Mod 3. So they addressed their two research questions. How has student learning changed post-COVID-19 shutdown, school building shutdown? And then do student learning changes vary by student, school, or classroom characteristics? And they found that in research question 1, there appears to be significant learning changes for students compared to the other years, as we saw in the presentation of findings. And we also saw in the presentation of finding that this fake district found that students who are economically disadvantaged really appear to be doing much worse than those who are not. So the follow-up questions that this district generated was, okay, well, so did students who do summer school, did they experience some sort of buffering effect by attending summer school? And so potential data collection activity for this particular district, because they have these administrative records, are actually to go in and look and see if they can do more analysis around the students who attended summer school to see if maybe the learning loss was different than the rest of the population. And then in terms of their second research question, they found that there was much more learning loss with students who are economically disadvantaged. And so they want to know, are they equipped to participate in remote learning? Maybe was that a contributing factor when it came to that learning loss in the spring of 2020? And are there additional resources that maybe these families need? So this district decided, we have enough of an idea of what we're really looking for, so we're going to do some surveys to families. And in this example, this district went ahead and administered them via email, and we would recommend that they would also administer them via paper or mail so that they capture all of the families and in different languages. Next slide. So once districts have sort of gone past this next step and they're just ready to start sharing these findings, and again, we'll reference our fake district that we're using to structure this toolkit, there's a couple of considerations that we use as parameters in the toolkit. Next slide. The most efficient process of trying to sort of figure out how you're going to disseminate findings is a way to narrow down how your research or how your findings are going to be impactful. And that's the first question is the who. Who will they be impactful for? So they can be impactful, your findings can help teachers make decisions about how to structure their instruction. They can help administrators, school administrators, understand where resources might need to be allocated or more resources might need to be allocated. The question to ask yourself is this information also helpful for parents? Would parents benefit from knowing sort of where the gaps are or how to help kids, or even, you know, just that the district is trying to address this or understand it. So that's the first question to ask yourself. What's your audience? And what are the number of audiences for whatever it is that you found? And then for each of those audiences, what's the goal in disseminating these findings to them? What's the goal in telling them about what you found? The goal will be different by different audiences. So the goal of sharing findings with the teacher might be different than the goal of sharing findings with administrative staff across a district. And then what kind of format are these audiences most attuned to? What are they most likely to engage with? This is super important if you're considering making any of this public or sort of part of a broader public narrative. You know, and also I find working with schools, administrative staff, you know, having something that can be summarized briefly in a page or 2 pages or in some sort of visual is often much more helpful and much more likely to get taken up. And then what structure and language are you using? And I know we do use some technical language in the toolkit where we were aware of that. We did try and parse it down a little bit, but that is a super important consideration. What kind of language are you using? This is really important too in terms of if you have findings of different subgroups of students, to communicate that you know there's sort of a holistic way of looking at your students, and really there's an intention behind understanding, you know, why different subgroups do better or worse, not necessarily that that's the expectation that they would do better or worse. I guess I'm saying not to relay bias in our language is super, super important. But thinking about the language and that structure is that last piece of how do we communicate findings. And then the final consideration that the workbook actually walks you through is how timely does this need to be for different audiences? Who should be prioritized in terms of sharing findings? Who will need that for their immediate work? Next slide. So in the toolkit, we sort of have a pause point for the districts, yourselves and the districts that you work with, to talk through the Planning for Action Worksheet 2B, which walks you through all of those considerations for disseminating findings, including developing a timeline and assigning responsibilities, because again, this is also acknowledging that qualitative data collection can be more time consuming and require more personnel than analyzing extant data. Next slide. And last of all, we have a slide we have a worksheet that walks through sort of the very first planning point in what kind of resources might be needed based on what you've found using this toolkit. So in this version of the toolkit, we do include the resources that have been provided by the Ohio Department of Education. And certainly, and I don't know if Heather's still on, but I'll let her talk a little bit if she'd like to, but you can certainly reach out to her and her team at any time for additional resources. In the IES posted toolkit, this will, the resources will actually just be IES resources. But this worksheet walks districts through thinking through what kind of needs have been identified, where the evidence base is. This is really connecting the evidence base to the need is really important because we want to make sure that we're making evidence-based decisions. So using this worksheet is just a way to visually lay this out and make sure that you have this recorded for perpetuity. Discussing all possible resources that you have available to you, and developing an action plan of how you're going to start gathering those resources and what the next step might be. Next slide. Right, so this is our last module. So I'm going to invite you to ask questions in the chat box or come on screen and ask us any questions that you might have about anything we've discussed today, or make suggestions for resources or additional support that we can provide.
It doesn't look like we have any questions yet in the chat box, but feel free to ask any questions if they come to mind.
Okay. All right, so ask you to go to the next slide. We just want to thank everybody for taking the time to sit with us through this webinar and participate in our breakouts and our chat boxes. We really appreciate the work that you do with districts. I have to say we're pretty in awe of how much support and you provide to your districts. It's Cora's posting a survey in the chat box, so please let us know any feedback that you have on the webinar today. We have 2 more of these to do, so anything we can do to make this the most efficient use of your time and make this the most effective presentation of the toolkit, we welcome those suggestions. All right, thank you everybody, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.